security intelligence. I've been thinking about this for a long time. When I was the chief security officer at NERC, I was briefed a few times on classified threat-related things directed at the electric utility industry, but the people that really needed to know it didn't have a security clearance, so the value of the information was useless to them. And even when they did get briefed on classified information, it was usually information that they said they already knew about. So the value, the timeliness of the government information was always behind the curve. But there continues to be a mystique to classified information. People feel like if they're not getting it, they're missing something. But when they do get it, I think they're usually disappointed. My CEO, he actually had a top secret SCI clearance. And after the second time he got a brief, he's like, why am I doing this? I'm not learning anything new, and this is an absolute waste of time for me to go to these briefs. And I think that's not necessarily unusual for the kind of information that the government does provide to the private sector. When I started at DHS in November of 2011, the first document I read was a report by Carnegie Mellon that documented the results of the Defense Industrial Base pilot. I think probably some of you have seen that or read it or heard about it. But anyway, the DIB pilot was a program to provide classified countermeasures and signatures to certain defense-related private sector companies, and there were about 20 companies that participated in that pilot program. The report wasn't flattering, and even though there were, I think, some rational explanations for why, it makes my case here today, so I'm going to use some of the numbers a little bit. Of all the incidents during the period of the pilot, about 5 months, only about 4% of those signatures and countermeasures were unique to the private sector. Let me say it again. 4% included information that the private sector DIB companies did not already know about. Now, to be fair, I think the expectations weren't established appropriately to begin with, and the program was getting better toward the end. But the bottom line is that the private sector found very little value in the information that the government was providing back to them. Certainly not enough value for them to spend money to continue participating in that. And if you think about some of the other private sector reporting, some of the public things that we've seen about over the past couple of years, the Tracking GhostNet report, I think that was 2009, the McAfee Shady Rat report, the Lucky Cat report that Trend Micro put out, and then most recently, Mandiant's APT1 report. There was, I think, DNS Changer and Core Flood, where actually the DNS Changer and Core Flood, while the government eventually got involved in it, most of the initial work done on those was done by the private sector. And then there are the annual reports by Verizon, Symantec, and McAfee that actually are a pretty good accumulation of information that those organizations have seen over the past year. Anyone remember the Configure Working Group? Some of you probably were part of the Configure Working Group. And that was coordination and collaboration by the private sector to develop something really important and really useful. And these guys and gals actually spent time and spent money out of their own pockets to help everybody, to help the nation. And despite Herculean efforts to get the government involved, they did that on their own. That was a private sector initiative. And if you haven't read Mark Bowden's book, it's called Worm, titled Worm. It walks through the entire Configure Cabal incident. It's a pretty interesting book. And this was all done in the private sector. So you can agree or disagree, I think, with some of these reports, and there's certainly some of you. I don't agree with everything that's in some of these reports that were put out over the last couple of years. But the bottom line is they were developed without the government involvement. They were developed in the private sector. And I think one interesting thing that came out of that was they had the unintentional consequence of forcing the government to actually acknowledge some of the nation-state actors that were involved in some of these events. That was one of the things when I was the Deputy Undersecretary at DHS, as I traveled around the country and met with different companies, the almost continuous theme I got was, why isn't the government doing something about this? And not really part of this discussion today, but I can tell you one of the biggest discussions we had on a continuing basis at the highest levels of the federal government is, what is the role of the federal government in some of these events and some of these activities, especially where nation states were involved. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask, does the U.S. government have a greater intelligence gathering capacity than the private sector? And I think it depends. It depends on the value of classified cybersecurity information, because it seems to be a increasingly small subset of information potentially available to identify the source and understand attack methodology and adversary capabilities. This brings us to what I think is probably one of the most important problems with government information, and that's overclassification. Anyone in here that has had access to classified information, I think, has thought this from time to time, that the information you're seeing is the same, that has a classified sticker on it, is the same information that you saw on CNN yesterday. And this is really a big problem for us for a whole lot of reasons. But primarily, information gets classified primarily for two reasons. One, to protect the source, where the information came from. Two, protect the method, how the government obtained that information. Most security professionals, I certainly know when I was the CISO, I didn't care about that. All I cared about was the information of value to me and could it help me protect my systems and my networks. So I think the government has to get better about taking that kind of truly classified information and declassifying or sanitizing it to the point where it's of value to the private sector. So I'm not saying that there isn't any value in any classified information, because there is, obviously, and government is rightly responsible for that. It's just that once the information does become classified, it becomes much harder to share, and the vast majority of threat intelligence that we need can be found in the open source anyway. I have a CSO friend who isn't a U.S. citizen, and his CEO is not a U.S. citizen. But he happens to be the CSO at a very large critical infrastructure company here in the U.S. with a pretty big footprint, and actually responsible for a pretty large chunk of something very important to the nation. But he can't get any classified information, and his CEO can't get any classified information. You can see how that would be a really big problem. Most people don't know this, actually, and I didn't know until I worked at NERC, but the U.S. gets a lot of our electricity from Canada. In fact, the lights in here are probably being powered by electricity that was generated in Canada 5 minutes or 5 seconds ago. But you can see that there's a problem there as well. As while we work with the Canadian utilities on a lot of things, we don't work with them on sharing cybersecurity threat information, because they don't have U.S. government security clearances, so we can't share that kind of information. And that's a big problem. Worked with another story when I was at NERC. I worked with a CSO, and we had discovered a pretty big vulnerability in his company, and the source of it was classified information. When he briefed his CEO and his CFO on it, and he needed some funding, some out-of-cycle funding to fix the problem, he couldn't tell him what the source of why he needed the money, because it was classified information. So it's pretty tough to go to your CFO with your hand out and hoping that your good looks and smile are going to get him to write you a check. Some of you are probably aware of the executive order that was signed by the President in February of this year. It has a number of things, but has three primary components related to information sharing. One is a provision for expedited private sector security clearances. Two is an increase in the volume, timeliness, and quality of the cyber threat information that DHS and the government provides to the private sector. And the third thing is private sector access to the DHS classified enhanced cybersecurity program. The ECS program is an avenue that the government shares classified information with certain critical infrastructure companies. So these are noble goals, I think, as laid out in the executive order, but I don't think there's any way to scale by providing more security clearances. You know, there simply is not enough manpower and not enough money to provide security clearances to all the people in the nation and all the critical infrastructures that need them. And I don't think you can even get close to it. So you know, this was something that was in the executive order that I think it's a noble goal, but probably not very realistic. And you know, to bring up the Snowden thing again, you know, in the post-Snowden world, getting clearances to non-government employees is going to be a lot more difficult. So the second one, increasing the amount of information provided back to the private sector, I think will have limited impact. And getting a handful of companies, again, the scaling of this is critical. Getting a handful of companies access to more of the classified information is not going to solve the problem. Okay, so that's some of the bad news. I always like to wrap things up, talk about some positive things. And there are some positive things going on. Sometimes, you know, you look at something and it looks bad and the end result of it is not so bad. For the past year, most of you know, the banking and finance industry has been going through these DDoS events. And they've been very, very challenging for many of the banks and many of the ISPs. And they have spent a ton of money combating these and preparing for these. But a couple of good things happened out of it. The first was I actually saw CSOs from these large banks and large companies sitting together in a room talking about how to address this problem. And I can tell you, 2 years ago, you couldn't have got all these people in the room talking about issues like this. I talked with one CISO at a very large bank, and she said, yeah, this was an absolute nightmare for us, but it was good because it does we have really opened the lines of communications across this entire sector in ways that never would have happened. And so there's a lot of information sharing happening now on things other than the DDoS related events that's really, I think, helped the banking and finance industry an awful lot. So we need more of that kind of collaboration. There's an old military saying that cohesion is a combat multiplier. And we need more cohesion across the board and across all sectors to build the relationships both within and across industries so that when cyber threats do surprise us, we can pull together the right kinds of teams more quickly than the well-meaning but far too complex federal government. Sometimes it actually does take a crisis to get us to work together. I'm sure a few of you are involved with the developing of some of the information exchange frameworks. I want to talk about 3 of them very, very briefly. The TAXI program, Trusted Automated Exchange of Indicator Information, being run out of MITRE, but it's really an open source operation. A lot of people are involved with this. And TAXI is an open source collaborative community development initiative working to define protocols and messages that allow for sharing of actionable cyber threat information. What TAXI does is give organizations improved situational awareness about emerging threats, and then allows them to share whatever information they choose with the partners they choose to do so. You also have the Mandiant Open IOC framework and the IETF's Incident Object Description Exchange Format, or IODEF. The Mandiant Open IOC framework allows you to document and categorize forensic artifacts of an